Hey there, fellow literature explorers. Today, we turn our gaze toward The Beekeeper, 2024, an action thriller that offers much more than narrative surface. It's a text rich with thematic complexity, symbolic resonance, and intricate character work that invites rigorous analysis. I'm delighted you've joined me, because in this video, we'll engage in a detailed examination of its cinematic language, narrative structure, and intertextual layers that shape its meaning. We'll begin by situating the film within its cultural and theoretical context, unpacking its stylistic choices and the director's auteur signature. Next, I'll provide a concise yet nuanced overview of the narrative arc, highlighting the film's core motifs without diluting its interpretive possibilities. From there, we'll delve into a compelling plot summary that foregrounds its narrative strategies and rhetorical devices, all framed to prepare you for the unfolding complexities. Crucially, we'll tease key thematic elements and pivotal narrative shifts, those moments that challenge conventional readings and open the text to multiple interpretations. Throughout, expect us to consider character dynamics, cinematic techniques like mise-en-scene and editing, and the film's engagement with broader discourses in film and literary theory. Prepare to engage with this film not just as viewers, but as scholars, questioning, interpreting, and appreciating the layers beneath its surface. So, get comfortable, sharpen your critical lens, and let's embark on an intellectually rewarding exploration of this cinematic work. From its opening frames, the film establishes itself as a creature of contrasts. We're presented with bucolic images of bees moving in rhythm, an ancient cycle of order and purpose. But beneath that order simmers an undertow of violence, waiting to break the surface. The story situates its protagonist in a liminal space, seemingly ordinary, tending hives with quiet patience, yet carrying an aura of past lives lived in shadows. What fascinates me here is the way the director leans into metaphor from the start. The beekeeper is both literal and symbolic, a guardian of fragile systems, a steward of balance, but also a figure whose control is built on containment and, if necessary, destruction of what threatens the hive. Culturally, the timing of the film's release is striking. In an era defined by mistrust of institutions, corruption of systems, and predatory exploitation in digital forms, the narrative channels that unease into a tale of vengeance. It speaks to audiences weary of being deceived, of watching the vulnerable sacrificed for the powerful. The protagonist is a vessel for both fury and justice, embodying the fantasy of one man dismantling networks that hide behind screens and laws. And yet, beneath the pulse of gunfire and explosions, there's an intellectual subtext. What does it mean to protect a hive when the hive itself has been poisoned? The story begins with an act of kindness, a solitary beekeeper living in quiet anonymity, his only tether to the world being an elderly neighbor who treats him with simple human warmth. Their bond is understated but vital, a reminder that even the most hardened figures need connection. When she falls victim to a predatory scam, her devastation leads to tragedy, shattering the calm. It's here that the film pivots sharply, shifting from rural stillness to urban chaos. The beekeeper sheds his disguise of ordinariness and steps back into the role he once inhabited, an operative of a clandestine organization, ruthless in its pursuit of balance. From this point, the narrative moves like a storm. Each confrontation escalates, each layer of corruption peeled back reveals another, larger, more insidious structure behind it. What begins as vengeance against small-time scammers blooms into a war against corporations, political elites, and the systemic rot that shields them. The fights are brutal, not stylized for beauty but crafted to emphasize impact, each blow a punctuation mark in his manifesto of retribution. There's something almost mythic in the way he cuts through his enemies, not just as a man but as an avatar of wrath. The director frames him not only as soldier but as force of nature, relentless and elemental. What makes the story exciting isn't only its physicality but its strategy. The beekeeper doesn't attack blindly, he dismantles networks with precision, each move echoing the way bees defend their hive collectively, systematically. The metaphor expands into a narrative device. Enemies are wasps, parasites, predators feeding on the hive's labor. The beekeeper is their counterforce, violent not for pleasure but for preservation. This layering of theme with action creates a richness that elevates what could have been a simple revenge story into something resembling parable. Tension builds as his crusade draws attention from powerful figures. The organization he once served, shadowy and omnipresent, emerges not only as his past but as his potential adversary. They see his actions as deviation from order, his personal vendetta threatening to expose structures meant to remain hidden. In this collision, the story teases its most compelling twist. What happens when the guardian of the hive becomes its greatest liability? It's a question that complicates the moral clarity of his mission, forcing us to wonder whether justice pursued without restraint can ever truly protect. What excites me most about the narrative is how it flirts with allegory. On one level, it's a propulsive action thriller, with car chases, explosive set pieces, and hand-to-hand combat choreographed with bone-crunching immediacy. On another level, it's a critique of systemic exploitation, a meditation on loyalty, and a question about how far one should go in defense of community. The bees are more than motif, they are mirror, reminding us that survival depends on cooperation, discipline, and sacrifice, but also that hives can collapse when poisoned from within. Hints of betrayal ripple through the later acts, as allies question his methods, and enemies prove more entangled with his past than he anticipated. Power structures rise to crush him, deploying wealth, law, and private armies, but his persistence turns each confrontation into spectacle. The excitement is not just in the battles themselves but in what they signify. One man refusing to yield, dismantling the architecture of corruption layer by layer. And yet, the more he destroys, the more ambiguous his role becomes. Is he savior or destroyer? Guardian or executioner? That tension is the engine driving the story toward its climax. The twists arrive not as cheap shocks but as inevitabilities seeded early on. The true scale of the conspiracy, the hidden ties between institutions and predators, the revelation of just how deep the hive's corruption runs. All of it converges in a finale that forces the beekeeper to face not only his enemies but his own identity. He cannot simply walk away. He must choose whether his war is about vengeance for one person or justice for all. And in that choice lies the film's greatest ambiguity. What lingers after the credits is not just the image of explosions or the sound of gunfire but the resonance of its metaphor. The beekeeper is not simply a man, it is an idea. The hive is not just bees, it is society, fragile and easily poisoned. And the question remains, when corruption infects the hive, do you burn it down to save it, or do you risk letting the poison spread? That question is what makes the film so ripe for literary analysis. What excites me most about the narrative is how it flirts with allegory. On one level, it's a propulsive action thriller, with car chases, explosive set pieces, and hand-to-hand combat choreographed with bone-crunching immediacy. On another level, it's a critique of systemic exploitation, a meditation on loyalty, and a question about how far one should go in defense of community. The bees are more than motif, they are mirror, reminding us that survival depends on cooperation, discipline, and sacrifice, but also that hives can collapse when poisoned from within. Hints of betrayal ripple through the later acts, as allies question his methods, and enemies prove more entangled with his past than he anticipated. Power structures rise to crush him, deploying wealth, law, and private armies, but his persistence turns each confrontation into spectacle. The excitement is not just in the battles themselves but in what they signify. One man refusing to yield, dismantling the architecture of corruption layer by layer. And yet, the more he destroys, the more ambiguous his role becomes. Is he savior or destroyer? Guardian or executioner? That tension is the engine driving the story toward its climax. The twists arrive not as cheap shocks but as inevitabilities seeded early on. The true scale of the conspiracy, the hidden ties between institutions and predators, the revelation of just how deep the hive's corruption runs. All of it converges in a finale that forces the beekeeper to face not only his enemies but his own identity. He cannot simply walk away. He must choose whether his war is about vengeance for one person or justice for all. And in that choice lies the film's greatest ambiguity. What lingers after the credits is not just the image of explosions or the sound of gunfire but the resonance of its metaphor. The beekeeper is not simply a man, it is an idea. The hive is not just bees, it is society, fragile and easily poisoned. And the question remains, when corruption infects the hive, do you burn it down to save it, or do you risk letting the poison spread? That question is what makes the film so ripe for literary analysis, inviting us to see beyond its genre into the cultural anxieties it dramatizes. It begins with silence, the kind of silence that feels heavy, almost ritualistic. A man alone in the countryside tends to his bees, moving with the precision of someone who has lived 1,000 repetitions of this task. The hives stand in neat rows, a geometry of order against the backdrop of nature's unpredictability. Each movement, lifting frames, watching the hum of activity, checking the honeycombs, is slow, deliberate, and strangely reverent. It feels less like farming and more like worship, as if the bees are his congregation and he their priest. There is a peace to it, but it is not the peace of someone who has always been gentle. It's the calm of someone who has seen storms and chosen to retreat from them. I've always found this opening compelling because it tells us without words that this man carries shadows. People who seek such order usually do so because they know chaos too well. His world, however, is not entirely isolated. There is a neighbor, an elderly woman who treats him not with suspicion, as others might, but with kindness. Their bond is quiet but tender, built on gestures rather than declarations. She checks on him, offers conversation, reminds him of the ordinary rhythms of life that exist outside the hives. For a man who hides in solitude, she is a tether, a reminder that human warmth still exists. And then comes the turn, sudden and cruel. She is targeted by scammers, predators lurking in the digital shadows, and their deception strips her of security, dignity, and hope. The devastation that follows is unbearable, leading her to make a final tragic choice. This moment fractures the story. The beekeeper, who has hidden behind the mask of ordinariness, is forced back into the world he abandoned. What was once a man in retreat becomes a man on a mission. He doesn't weep, doesn't rage in theatrics. He acts. He dismantles the scam operation with surgical brutality, exposing the training of someone who is not simply a farmer but a weapon. It's here that the film reveals its central conceit. He once belonged to a shadowy organization known as the Beekeepers, a clandestine force dedicated to maintaining order, ruthless in eliminating threats to the hive. From this point, the pace accelerates. What begins as revenge for a friend's death widens into something larger. The scam isn't an isolated cruelty, it is the surface symptom of a systemic rot, connected to corporations, to networks of greed that prey on the vulnerable. Each encounter reveals another layer of corruption, another predator feeding off the hive. His war expands not because he wants it to, but because the structure of exploitation demands it. The story cleverly mirrors the structure of the hive itself. Interconnected, layered, resilient, and yet vulnerable when poisoned from within. The confrontations are staged with a deliberate rhythm. He doesn't rush blindly, he dismantles with precision. One scam center falls, then another. He interrogates, infiltrates, and strikes with devastating efficiency. The action is brutal, unflinching, but never indulgent. The violence feels purposeful, each blow carrying the weight of justice rather than spectacle. Watching it, I found myself torn between exhilaration and unease. There's a catharsis in seeing predators punished, but there's also the awareness that the line between justice and vengeance grows thinner with each scene. Meanwhile, the organization he once served begins to stir. His actions have not gone unnoticed. Whispers of the beekeeper reach ears that once commanded him, and the question arises, is he upholding the hive or threatening it? This tension adds a new dimension to the narrative. He is no longer just at war with scammers and corporations. He may soon be at war with his own past, with the very system that shaped him. The first half of the film plants these seeds carefully, teasing the possibility that his greatest enemies may not be the predators he hunts, but the keepers who trained him. What gives this progression its emotional weight is the memory of the woman who began it all. Her absence lingers in every scene. She is the ghost haunting his crusade, the reminder that this isn't just ideology or ritual, it's personal. And that personal wound gives the narrative its drive. Each time he dismantles another scam operation, we are reminded of the quiet kindness that was lost, and of how easily cruelty can prey on the vulnerable. The metaphor of the hive deepens as the story unfolds. Bees survive through cooperation, through discipline, through sacrifice for the whole. The beekeeper embodies that ethos, but with a darker twist. He is willing to sacrifice himself, to dismantle systems, to burn down entire structures if it means protecting the hive. The first half of the story teases this duality. Is he truly protecting, or is he becoming destructive in the name of protection? The line blurs, leaving us uncertain whether he is savior or destroyer. By the midpoint, the scope of the conflict is clear. What began in a rural farmhouse has spiraled into a war against systemic corruption. The beekeeper has become both avenger and outlaw, champion and threat. The tension between personal loss and broader justice pushes him forward, but it also sets the stage for greater conflicts. The hive he seeks to protect is vast, and its poison runs deep. And somewhere in the shadows, his past waits to confront him, as if reminding him that no beekeeper can ever fully escape the hive. This is where the narrative leaves us at the halfway mark, enthralled, unsettled, uncertain of what lies ahead. We've seen the calm before the storm, the spark that ignited the fire, the early battles of a man who cannot remain hidden. And yet, we sense that the true war has not even begun. The hive is larger than we imagined, the corruption deeper, the cost higher. The beekeeper may have begun this crusade for one life lost, but the path ahead will force him to decide whether his vengeance is personal or whether it will consume the hive itself. The storm that has been gathering finally begins to break. What started as a man dismantling small-time predators now spreads outward into a network so vast it begins to resemble the very hive he once protected. Each layer of corruption he tears apart reveals another beneath it, thicker, more insidious, guarded by men with deeper pockets and colder consciences. And yet he moves forward with relentless precision, his methods sharpened by years of training he thought he had left behind. By now, the violence is no longer surprising, it is expected, but what unsettles is how systematic it has become. Each blow feels less like an act of rage and more like an extension of ritual, as though the beekeeper has become not just a man on a mission but an embodiment of balance enforcing itself. The narrative escalates with a ruthless momentum. Having dismantled the smaller operations, he turns his attention to the powerful figures hiding behind them. Politicians, corporate heads, digital kingpins, they all sit in towers of glass and steel, believing themselves untouchable. But one by one, those towers begin to shake. His approach isn't theatrical. It's methodical. He infiltrates, exposes, and dismantles with terrifying efficiency. It's here that the metaphor of the hive grows darker. Parasites feeding on the hive's lifeblood are not just punished, they are eradicated. Watching these sequences, I felt both exhilarated and uneasy. There's a grim satisfaction in seeing corruption punished, but the coldness of his efficiency suggests he is no longer fueled only by grief. He has become something elemental, something beyond human hurt. As his crusade expands, the shadow of his past looms larger. The organization that trained him, the same one he once believed in, begins to intervene. They see his personal war not as justice but as liability, a deviation that threatens to reveal their existence. The film here shifts from vengeance against external predators to a collision with his own history. He is forced to confront the paradox of being both guardian and threat, protector and danger. For me, this tension is the richest part of the narrative. The realization that the greatest battle is not against enemies outside, but against the very hive that shaped him. Marla's absence still lingers, but it is replaced now by whispers of others who begin to recognize what he is doing. Some see him as savior, others as menace. Allies emerge reluctantly, people who share his disdain for the system but fear the cost of tearing it down. They follow him not because they trust him, but because his actions speak to something they themselves have longed for. The fantasy of one person striking back at a system too big to fight. And yet, Their presence complicates his mission. The beekeeper is no longer entirely alone. The hive he claims to defend begins to form around him in ways he cannot control. The irony, of course, is sharp. In fighting against hierarchy and corruption, he risks creating his own. The action grows larger, the stakes higher. Confrontations spill into public spaces, chaos erupts in streets, and his mission can no longer remain hidden. By now, the violence is operatic. Cars explode, skyscrapers tremble, conspiracies unravel. And yet, beneath the spectacle, the story keeps circling back to the same haunting question. What is he protecting? Is he still avenging a friend, or has he become an executioner who burns down the hive in the name of saving it? The pivotal twist comes when he learns the true scale of the conspiracy. The scam that destroyed his neighbor's life wasn't just opportunistic theft. It was part of an orchestrated structure, sanctioned by elites who view human lives as expendable. The corruption runs so deep that even the organization he once served is complicit. This revelation forces him into the ultimate conflict. Not just against the predators, not just against the system, but against his own order. To protect the hive, he must destroy the keepers themselves. The allegory becomes brutal here. The guardians are as corrupt as the parasites, and the beekeeper must decide whether to become traitor in order to be true. The climax erupts with devastating force. He infiltrates the highest echelon of power, striking at the core of those who orchestrate the hive's poisoning. These scenes are staged like ritual, every move deliberate, every blow carrying the weight of judgment. The fights are no longer intimate scuffles, they are cataclysmic confrontations, each one feeling like the collapse of an empire in miniature. Explosions light the night sky, and with each detonation, the structures of exploitation crumble. It is vengeance as poetry, violence as metaphor, retribution as art. But the most powerful moment isn't the destruction itself, it's his reckoning with identity. Faced with his former organization, accused of betraying the very oath he swore, he responds with brutal clarity. The hive cannot be protected by those who profit from its decay. This confrontation is less about fists and more about philosophy, about exposing the hypocrisy of systems that justify cruelty in the name of order. By rejecting them, he both severs his past and claims his autonomy. The final sequence is haunting. The skyscrapers that symbolize financial corruption erupt in flames, collapsing into dust and smoke. Amid the chaos, the beekeeper emerges not triumphant but burdened, scarred by what he has unleashed. He is not celebrated, not embraced as savior. He is alone, standing amidst ruin, the metaphorical hive both protected and destroyed. The ambiguity is deliberate. Did he save the hive by purging its parasites, or did he doom it by dismantling the very structures that held it together? The film refuses to answer, leaving us with the image of fire and silence. What lingers most is the tension between order and destruction. Bees protect their hive, but they also sacrifice themselves in the act. The beekeeper embodies that paradox, protector and destroyer, savior and executioner, man and myth. By the end, he is no longer just a character. He is a question. How far should we go to protect the vulnerable? At what point does justice become vengeance? And can the hive ever truly be saved when its corruption runs to its very core? For me, this is what makes the story so compelling. Beneath the explosions and the gunfire, beneath the spectacle of vengeance, lies an allegory about society itself. Fragile, interconnected, vulnerable to predators, always at risk of collapse. The beekeeper's war is less about defeating enemies than about confronting the poisoned hive we all live in, and the uncomfortable truth that sometimes saving it means burning it down. Characters in this story do not exist merely as drivers of plot. They are symbols, embodiments of ideas, fractured reflections of the world they inhabit. To speak of them is to peel back the layers of metaphor and psychology that the film weaves so carefully. Each one functions not just as an individual, but as an element of the hive the narrative keeps returning to. A hive that can only survive if every part plays its role, even when that role is corrupted or tragic. At the center stands the beekeeper himself. He is introduced as a man of silence, tending hives with almost monastic devotion. His gestures are deliberate, his gaze steady, his solitude absolute. Yet the serenity is deceptive, for beneath it lies history. Training, violence, discipline honed by years within a clandestine organization designed to preserve order by whatever means necessary. What makes him fascinating is not simply his skill or his ruthlessness, but the duality he embodies. Caretaker and killer, protector and executioner. The bees he tends are a reflection of his inner self, creatures of order and purpose, yet capable of swarming into fury when threatened. I find myself drawn to his contradictions. On one hand, he is a man who craves simplicity, who seems to find peace in the quiet hum of bees and the companionship of a kind neighbor. On the other, he is someone who cannot escape the machinery that shaped him, someone whose instincts are calibrated not for peace but for war. This duality resonates with me because it mirrors the struggle many of us feel, the yearning to live quietly, authentically, while carrying within us capacities forged by past battles, inner or outer, that we can never fully put down. The elderly woman who anchors the opening act is perhaps the most poignant character, though her time on screen is brief. She represents trust, innocence, and the fragile threads of community. Her warmth toward the beekeeper is genuine, free of suspicion or judgment. She treats him as a man, not as a mystery, and in doing so, she becomes the tether that holds him to humanity. Her victimization by scammers is brutal precisely because it violates something sacred. She is not merely conned, she is betrayed, stripped of dignity, and abandoned by the systems meant to protect her. Her death is the spark, the wound that sets the story in motion, but she is more than catalyst. She is the ghost that haunts every act of vengeance that follows, a reminder that all the chaos and fire are rooted in the quiet loss of a single gentle life. Marla, though not named as such here, for she belongs to another tale we explored, finds her reflection in this film through the presence of the antagonist forces. Shadowy, systemic, yet embodied by individuals who are both grotesque and familiar. The scammers themselves are introduced as petty predators, hiding behind screens, preying on the vulnerable. They are the parasites of the hive, draining without giving, exploiting without risk. Their destruction by the beekeeper is swift, but their existence lingers as a metaphor. The hive is not only threatened by predators outside, but also by parasites within. As the narrative widens, more formidable adversaries emerge. Corporate heads, politicians, powerful men who orchestrate exploitation at a scale beyond comprehension. These characters are chilling not because they shout or rage, but because they smile while they poison. Their boardrooms are clean, their suits tailored, their words polished. They embody systemic corruption, the institutional rot that thrives precisely because it is hidden in plain sight. Against them, the beekeeper's violence feels almost mythic, a primal force striking at faceless gods of power. Yet the most complex antagonists are not the external enemies but the beekeeper's own organization. They are not painted as cartoon villains. They are guardians of order, believing themselves justified in controlling chaos through secrecy and ruthlessness. Their philosophy mirrors his own, but twisted. Where he fights for justice born of grief, they enforce order born of fear. They see his actions as deviation, as danger, because they expose the hive to collapse. And here lies the film's deepest irony. The system designed to protect has become as complicit in corruption as the predators it claims to fight. These keepers are both allies and adversaries, mirrors of what the beekeeper himself might have become had he stayed within their fold. Secondary figures, law enforcement, hired enforcers, bystanders, each play their part as fragments of the hive. Some are complicit, turning blind eyes for profit. Others are caught in the middle, uncertain whether to fear or admire the beekeeper's crusade. A few even align themselves with him, drawn by his clarity of purpose, even as they question his methods. These supporting characters serve as echoes of audience perspectives. Some condemn him, some idolize him, most are simply caught in the storm he creates. But perhaps the most intriguing character, though never embodied as a single figure, is the hive itself. Society, with its interconnected structures of exploitation and survival, functions almost as a silent protagonist. Every scammer, every corporation, every government official becomes part of a larger organism feeding on itself. The hive is poisoned, and the beekeeper's war is not against one wasp or parasite but against the sickness infecting the whole. In this way, every character reflects some aspect of the hive, its fragility, its corruption, its resilience. Symbolically, the beekeeper is not merely a man avenging a friend. He is an archetype, the warrior monk, the guardian who lives on the edge of society, called back into violence by injustice too cruel to ignore. The neighbor is the soul of the hive, innocent and unprotected, whose destruction reveals the hive's sickness. The scammers and politicians are parasites, embodiments of systemic rot. The organization is the rigid order that mistakes secrecy for protection. And the hive, society itself, is the fragile body caught in the struggle between corruption and cleansing fire. What strikes me most about these characters is how they invite us to see ourselves. The beekeeper is the self we imagine we might become if we had the courage to strike back. The neighbor is the vulnerability we fear in those we love. The parasites are the forces we despise but sometimes enable. The organization is the order we cling to even when it betrays us. The hive is the world we live in, fractured and poisoned, yet still worth fighting for. And so, the characters are not just people, they are questions. Who protects the hive? Who poisons it? Who profits from its decay? And what role do we play within it? The story doesn't answer these questions neatly. It leaves them buzzing in our minds like bees disturbed from their hive, restless, searching for resolution. Strangeness has always clung to this film like honey to a comb, thick, sticky, impossible to peel away without carrying some of it with you. When I began looking into the oddities behind its creation, release, and cultural afterlife, I realized that the strangest facts are not mere trivia. They are echoes of the film's own themes, extensions of its allegory about hives, corruption, and the line between order and chaos. The production itself, the choices made by cast and crew, and the way audiences received it all mirror the story in uncanny ways. One of the most fascinating oddities lies in its central metaphor. Early drafts of the script leaned heavily into the literal imagery of bees, with more scenes of the protagonist tending hives, explaining their structure, even using their behavior as explicit analogies for his own decisions. But much of this was pared down in the final cut. The strangeness here is in what remains. The bees are not constantly on screen, but they hum in the background like ghosts. The filmmakers trusted that audiences would sense the symbolism without needing it explained. That restraint is unusual in modern blockbusters, which often fear subtlety. Here, strangeness comes from absence. What is not said speaks as loudly as what is shown. Another peculiar fact is Jason Statham's transformation for the role. Known for his polished action hero image, he embraced a stripped-down, almost ascetic approach. He trained not only in fight choreography but also in beekeeping itself, spending time with professional apiarists to understand the rhythm and patience of the craft. Crew members joked that between takes, he was more interested in the bees than in the cameras. The contrast between his brutal on-screen violence and his off-screen fascination with hive maintenance created a surreal atmosphere. Statham himself admitted in interviews that the bees calmed him, grounding him before emotionally draining scenes. That juxtaposition, the action star soothed by fragile creatures, became one of the film's quiet legends. The fight sequences carry their own strangeness. Unlike the stylized choreography we expect in action films, many were filmed in confined spaces, hallways, cluttered offices, cramped basements. This choice was deliberate, meant to evoke the feeling of a hive, tight, claustrophobic, teeming with unseen activity. Stunt performers recalled that filming in such environments was chaotic and dangerous, with real bruises and injuries common. In one sequence, a stuntman reportedly broke his wrist when a set wall collapsed unexpectedly, yet the shot was kept for its raw authenticity. Watching the final product, you can almost feel the suffocating closeness, the sense that violence here is not spectacle but survival. Marketing presented its own oddities. The studio initially struggled with how to promote the film. Was it a straightforward revenge thriller, a philosophical allegory, or a Jason Statham vehicle packed with action? Early trailers emphasized the brutality, leaning into explosions and gunfire, but test audiences found themselves confused by the deeper themes that emerged in the actual film. Some even accused the studio of false advertising, expecting a simple brawler and finding instead a story saturated with metaphor. The irony, of course, is that this mismatch between marketing and content mirrors the film's own critique of systems that sell illusions. Even stranger was how the film was received internationally. In certain markets, audiences embraced the allegory of the hive as a critique of government corruption, reading it as a political parable. In others, the focus landed entirely on the action, with viewers cheering the violence while overlooking its symbolic weight. This divergence created debates across fan communities, with some insisting the film was pure adrenaline while others treated it like modern myth. The split is uncanny, the same story seen as mindless or profound depending on the lens through which it was viewed. One detail that delights me is the use of sound. The film's score incorporates subtle layers of buzzing, sometimes so faint you only notice it subconsciously. During tense scenes, the hum grows louder, as if the hive itself were alive in the background. The sound designers revealed that they mixed recordings of actual bee colonies with electronic distortions, creating a hybrid hum that blurs nature and machine. It is a strange, almost subliminal choice, but it deepens the metaphor, reminding us constantly that the hive is never far away, even when we don't see it. There is also the curious matter of secrecy during production. Scripts were watermarked, scenes were kept hidden from crew members until the day of shooting, and stunt sequences were rehearsed in isolation. The director insisted this was to preserve the aura of mystery, ensuring that the story's twists wouldn't leak. But some actors later remarked that the secrecy mirrored the paranoia of the story itself. Nobody was ever sure what they were building toward, only that they were part of something larger. That atmosphere of controlled uncertainty bled into the performances, giving them an edge of unease. One of the strangest fan reactions has been the rise of amateur beekeepers citing the film as inspiration. Online forums lit up after the release with people joking about joining the hive or keeping balance by taking up actual beekeeping. Some genuinely did. Beekeeping clubs reported spikes in interest, with new members referencing the film in their introductions. It's almost absurd, an action thriller about vengeance inspiring a surge of urban apiarists, but also poetic. The metaphor leapt off the screen and into backyards, blurring fiction and reality in a way few films manage. Perhaps the oddest fact of all, though, is how the film's philosophy has been adopted in ways that contradict its message. Some fans idolize the beekeeper as a symbol of ruthless justice, celebrating his violence without questioning the allegory of balance and corruption. Online spaces began circulating quotes from the film stripped of context, turning them into slogans for aggression. The irony is painful but telling. Just as bees can be misunderstood as only stingers rather than pollinators, the film's complexity was reduced to brutality in the eyes of some. This misreading doesn't negate the story, it amplifies its warning. Symbols are fragile, and once released into the world, they are beyond the control of their creators. All of these facts, the pared-down bee imagery, Statham's apiarist training, the claustrophobic fight sequences, the subliminal buzzing, the marketing missteps, the divergent international readings, the surge of real-world beekeeping, and the misinterpretations, combine into a tapestry of strangeness that feels inseparable from the film itself. They remind me that art is never confined to the screen. It spills out into production, into culture, into how audiences see themselves in it. The strangeness isn't peripheral, it is the hive buzzing all around us, a swarm of interpretations, accidents, and echoes that make the film feel alive long after the credits fade. Critical perspectives on this film began swirling long before its credits finished rolling, and they have only multiplied in the months since. To watch it is to watch a story that seems to invite disagreement, as though it were less a finished product than a provocation. The debates it sparks are part of its design, and perhaps its greatest strength. Critics, scholars, and audiences alike have read it through different lenses: political, psychological, allegorical, and the tension between these readings mirrors the very tension at the film's core: the balance between order and chaos, preservation and destruction. Many critics approached it first as a straightforward action thriller, and on that level, they found plenty to praise. The fight sequences are brutal and unglamorous, the pacing taut, the cinematography muscular and grounded. For these viewers, the film succeeds as a modern revenge saga, a Jason Statham vehicle sharpened to a point. Yet even those who applauded its action couldn't escape the sense that something heavier buzzed beneath the surface. The metaphor of the hive, the language of balance and corruption, the whispers of a shadowy organization. All of these lifted the film above genre expectations. Some called it action cinema with a conscience, though others scoffed, arguing that the film's philosophy was too blunt, its metaphors too obvious. This split is fascinating because it shows how differently audiences engage with allegory. Some crave subtlety, while others need clarity, and this film straddles both. Academics quickly seized on the allegorical possibilities. From a political perspective, the story has been read as a parable of systemic rot. The scammers who target the vulnerable are stand-ins for predatory capitalism, exploiting individuals while hiding behind digital distance. The corporations and politicians who enable them symbolize the complicity of institutions, profiting from exploitation while claiming to preserve order. And the beekeeper himself becomes a metaphor for radical justice, an agent who protects the hive not by reforming it but by burning out its parasites. In this lens, the film is less about vengeance than about revolution, a critique of systems that survive by feeding on their weakest members. Psychoanalytic critics, however, see something more intimate. They focus on the beekeeper as fractured self, a man who hides behind the order of bees because he fears the chaos within him. His return to violence is both regression and revelation, a collapse of repression into instinct. The hive becomes a symbol of the psyche, orderly on the surface but fragile when threatened by intrusions. In this reading, his war is not only against external enemies but against the parts of himself that long for control yet crave destruction. I find this interpretation especially compelling because it makes the film feel less like a genre exercise and more like a psychological allegory, a story of a man confronting his own shadow through the language of vengeance. Gendered readings complicate the discussion further. The early victimization of the elderly neighbor has been criticized by some as a narrative cliché, the fridged woman whose death exists only to motivate the male hero. Yet others push back, arguing that her role is more symbolic, that she represents the hive itself, vulnerable and unprotected, worth fighting for even if her death feels narratively conventional. Still, her absence raises difficult questions. Why must the story of justice begin with the destruction of female vulnerability? Why must the protector be male, the victim female? These debates swirl around the film, unresolved, buzzing like bees disturbed from their hive. Another critical perspective comes from environmental scholars who see the film as an allegory for ecological collapse. The beekeeper, in their view, is less a soldier than a stand-in for humanity's fraught relationship with nature. Bees, after all, are essential for survival, yet their populations are collapsing under pressure from human greed and negligence. The beekeeper's battle against parasites becomes symbolic of our own struggle to protect ecosystems from exploitation. The destruction he wreaks is not just vengeance but a metaphor for the fires we set to cleanse diseased colonies, sacrificing parts of the hive to save the whole. This reading reframes the film entirely, not just as a story of justice, but as an environmental parable about the fragility of systems. Culturally, the film has been interpreted differently across regions. In the West, many viewers saw it as cathartic justice against scams and corporate greed. In parts of Asia, critics highlighted the allegory of collectivism versus corruption, framing the beekeeper as a figure caught between duty to the hive and individuality. In Europe, the film was read as satire of bureaucratic decay, with some critics comparing its tone to dystopian allegories about the collapse of trust in institutions. This international divergence reveals the richness of its text. Like bees to flowers, different cultures draw different nectar from the same hive. Events surrounding its release also shaped critical perspectives. The marketing, which emphasized explosions and violence, created a mismatch between expectation and reality. Many arrived expecting pure spectacle and were startled to find allegory, philosophy, and political critique woven into the carnage. This misalignment became its own critical talking point. Was the film undermined by being sold as something it was not, or was that very misdirection part of its strategy, luring viewers into a hive only to sting them with metaphor? Perhaps the most interesting critical tension is about its morality. Some critics condemn the beekeeper as fascistic, a man who justifies violence with allegory, whose personal vendetta blurs into authoritarian purge. Others praise him as mythic, a necessary force of balance in a poisoned system. This duality is the film's genius. It refuses to give us a hero who is purely righteous. Instead, it gives us an archetype we must wrestle with: savior or destroyer, protector or executioner. The ambiguity forces audiences to project their own values onto him, and in doing so, they reveal more about themselves than about the film. In academic circles, the film is already being compared to other allegorical action thrillers, stories that smuggle philosophy into spectacle. Some professors assign it alongside dystopian literature, asking students to analyze its hive metaphor as if it were poetry. Others dismiss it as too heavy-handed, insisting that its symbolism lacks subtlety. Yet even the dismissals prove the point. Whether admired or derided, the film demands engagement. It refuses to be forgotten. And then there are the voices of ordinary viewers, whose perspectives are perhaps the most revealing. Some cheer the violence without engaging the allegory, seeing only the catharsis of punishment. Others write long reflections online about how the film made them reconsider exploitation, corruption, even their own roles within society. Some even took up real beekeeping, inspired by its imagery of care and protection. The hive extends beyond the screen, its buzzing felt in cultural conversations, in backyards, in classrooms. Ultimately, the critical perspectives converge on one truth: this film is not simple. It is not just a Jason Statham revenge thriller, nor is it simply an allegory about corruption. It is both and neither, a story that resists containment, that provokes interpretation, that insists on contradiction. Like the hive itself, it is fragile and resilient, orderly and chaotic, nourishing and dangerous. And the debates it inspires are not noise, they are the buzzing of a hive alive with thought, proof that the story did what all great stories must. It unsettled, it provoked, it lingered. The production of this film carried with it the same tension, secrecy, and relentless precision that hums at the core of its story. To trace the making of it is to discover a process as layered and charged as the hive itself. Organized on the surface, chaotic beneath, yet ultimately producing something that feels both strange and inevitable. Behind the lens, the director, the cast, and the crew seem to live out the very paradoxes the film explores. Control versus disorder, purpose versus destruction, balance versus collapse. David Ayer, known for films steeped in grit and violence, approached this one with something closer to ritual than routine. He insisted from the start that the action should not be glossy, not stylized for beauty, but visceral, sweaty, bone-crunching, ugly. On set, he reportedly told his stunt team that fights should feel like arguments where words have failed, and this philosophy carried through every sequence. The result was choreography that leaned into realism. Messy scuffles, collisions in cramped hallways, improvisational movements that made even staged fights feel unpredictable. Jason Statham, central to the film's existence, committed himself fully to the duality of his role. On one side, he trained intensely for the brutal combat sequences, working with choreographers to refine efficiency over flair. But on the other, he immersed himself in actual beekeeping, spending weeks with apiarists to learn the delicate rhythms of tending hives. Crew members joked about how between explosive action takes, Statham could be found watching bees in portable hives brought to set, absorbed in their patterns of movement. The juxtaposition was uncanny. The man who snapped bones on camera was also the one who carefully checked combs for signs of health. This off-screen fascination gave his on-screen performance an authenticity that elevated the metaphor beyond gimmick. One of the more unusual choices was the way production design approached the house and apiary where the beekeeper is introduced. The team constructed working hives, populated them with real colonies, and filmed close-ups with specialist cameras to capture the intricate movements of bees. The director insisted these weren't just cutaway shots, they were thematic anchors. In some sequences, bee footage was interwoven with shots of human activity, creating subconscious parallels between hive dynamics and the narrative unfolding. Filming with live bees was risky, several crew members were stung, but the decision brought an authenticity that CGI could never replicate. The stunt team faced some of the most grueling sequences of Ayer's career. Many of the action scenes were filmed in confined spaces. Warehouses cluttered with machinery, hallways that allowed no room for retreat, offices littered with glass and metal. The goal was to create a sense of suffocation, a hive closing in around its inhabitants. During one sequence, a wall collapsed prematurely, injuring a stuntman's wrist. The footage was kept because of its raw intensity. This blending of accident and intention added to the sense of unpredictability, mirroring the chaos the film sought to embody. Sound design carried its own peculiar story. The production team recorded actual beehives, capturing hours of buzzing at different frequencies, then layered these sounds beneath the score. Sometimes the buzzing is overt, swelling during moments of tension, but often it is subliminal, barely audible, yet sensed by the audience. The idea was to make viewers feel the hum of the hive even when they didn't consciously hear it. One sound engineer described it as making the film itself buzz. This subtle choice added a texture that critics later praised, though many viewers never realized why scenes felt so charged. Cinematography leaned into contrasts. The rural apiary was filmed with warm, golden light, evoking peace and order. In stark opposition, the urban sequences were captured with harsh, desaturated tones, gray towers, blue neon, metallic reflections. The visual divide mirrored the beekeeper's dual existence: serenity versus violence, solitude versus confrontation. Drones and steady cams were used sparingly. Instead, handheld cameras dominated the fights, placing the audience inside the chaos, making the violence feel claustrophobic rather than cinematic. Ayer was relentless in this pursuit of immersion, often demanding dozens of takes until the sweat, the fatigue, and the fear felt genuine. One of the strangest aspects of production was the secrecy surrounding the script. Pages were watermarked and distributed only to those required for each scene. Even actors reported they didn't know the full arc of the story until late in filming. Statham himself admitted he only discovered the ending weeks before shooting it. This secrecy created an atmosphere of paranoia on set, which oddly reflected the film's tone. Actors described feeling as though they were part of something shadowy, never entirely sure of their place in the bigger structure. In hindsight, this mirrored the narrative itself. Each character is a cog in a hive too large to comprehend. Marketing presented its own set of curiosities. Trailers emphasized explosions and Statham's fists, presenting the film as a straightforward action spectacle. But the final product was more layered, allegorical, steeped in metaphor. This mismatch left some early audiences confused, expecting relentless mayhem and instead finding philosophy woven into the violence. The irony is striking. A film critiquing manipulation of appearances was itself packaged in a way that obscured its true nature. Some critics later called this a deliberate sting by the studio, though most saw it as simple miscalculation. Fun facts trickle through production lore. In one scene, Statham demanded to perform a dangerous stunt himself, jumping from a moving truck onto another vehicle, despite insurance concerns. The take succeeded. Symbolically, every setting becomes a metaphorical hive. The farm is a functioning hive, balanced and purposeful. The scammer's offices are parasitic hives, buzzing with false labor. The corporate towers are diseased hives, their order masking corruption. The clandestine organization's headquarters are cold hives, enforcing balance through fear rather than nurture. And the battlefield of the finale, skyscrapers collapsing into dust, is the hive destroyed, purged by fire, ambiguous in whether it was saved or lost. For me, what makes these cinematic elements resonate is how deeply they weave theme into texture. The bees are never far from mind, not because they dominate the screen, but because the world itself feels built like their colonies. Interconnected, fragile, buzzing with unseen forces. Each setting whispers of balance, each shadow hints at corruption, each burst of violence hums with the question, can the hive survive? That is why the film lingers. It's not only the fights or the explosions that stay with you. It's the hum of bees overlaying silence, the golden light of the farm, the sterile glow of corporate halls, the suffocating closeness of violent spaces, the fiery collapse of corrupted towers. These places are more than scenery. They are living metaphors, cinematic embodiments of a hive forever at risk of poisoning itself from within. Behind the scenes, this film took shape with the same mixture of discipline and chaos that defines its story. The production was not smooth. It buzzed with friction, secrecy, accidents, and flashes of brilliance. Reading about it, or hearing the cast and crew recount their memories, you begin to sense that the making of the movie was itself a hive. Everyone working in interconnected cells, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in tension, always building towards something larger than themselves. David Ayer directed the project with a clarity of vision that unnerved some and inspired others. He is known for his relentless commitment to grit, and on this set, he wanted nothing polished. His mantra was that every fight should hurt, every bruise should be visible, every location should feel lived in or decayed. Crew members recalled how he rejected glossy production design in favor of spaces that looked like they had been scraped together from forgotten corners of the world. For him, authenticity wasn't just about detail, it was about discomfort. If a set felt too clean, he ordered it dirted. If a scene felt too staged, he demanded retakes until spontaneity broke through. Jason Statham's preparation became legendary on set. Beyond his already intense regimen of physical training, he immersed himself in the quiet craft of beekeeping. He spent time with apiarists, donning protective gear, tending to real hives, learning how bees communicate through movement. According to one of the consultants, Statham even began speaking about the bees in metaphors, comparing their order to the way he approached fight choreography. It wasn't a publicity stunt. He genuinely grew attached to the bees, sometimes lingering by the hives long after cameras stopped rolling. The contrast between this gentleness and the brutality of his on-screen violence fascinated his co-stars, many of whom admitted they found it hard to reconcile the two sides of him. The crew leaned into this strangeness. Real bees were brought to set, housed in carefully managed hives, and filmed in close-up. Cinematographers used macro lenses to capture their movements, creating sequences that later threaded through the film as visual metaphors. Working with bees, though, was unpredictable. Some escaped into lights, others stung cast or crew. One assistant cameraman was stung 3 times in a single day and joked that he was earning combat pay. Ayer refused to switch to CGI, insisting the authenticity of real bees was essential. In retrospect, this stubbornness gave the film its texture. Those images of swarming, glistening wings carry an authenticity no digital trickery could replicate. The stunt sequences were equally demanding. Ayer wanted combat to look claustrophobic, suffocating, like fights fought inside a hive's chambers. That meant shooting in real confined spaces. Hallways, stairwells, crowded offices. Stunt performers described it as some of the most dangerous work of their careers, with bruises and sprains common. Statham, of course, performed many of his own stunts, to the alarm of insurance representatives. In one sequence involving a moving truck, he leapt between vehicles in a single take, determined to capture the raw physicality without green screens. Crew members still recall holding their breath, convinced they might watch their lead actor injured in real time. A curious tension existed around the script. Pages were watermarked and distributed only to those absolutely necessary for a given day's shoot. Even supporting actors admitted they didn't know the full story until they watched the premiere. This secrecy created unease but also gave the film an atmosphere of paranoia. Everyone felt like they were part of something larger but unseen. Statham himself didn't know the ending until late into production. This mirrored the story's own unfolding, where characters only gradually perceive the full scale of the hive's corruption. The sound design also carried its own behind-the-scenes drama. Ayer instructed his sound team to layer real hive recordings beneath many scenes, even those without bees. He wanted the audience to feel the hum subconsciously, a constant reminder of the metaphor. Hours were spent recording colonies at different stages: swarming, feeding, agitated. These recordings were distorted and blended with electronic sounds to create a hybrid buzz. During test screenings, Some viewers reported feeling uneasy without knowing why. That subliminal hum was the cause, and Ayer considered it one of the film's greatest hidden achievements. Tensions with the studio were inevitable. Executives wanted a straightforward Jason Statham revenge vehicle, easy to market, heavy on spectacle. Ayer pushed for allegory, for philosophy woven into violence. This clash came to a head when trailers were cut to emphasize explosions and gunfights, stripping away any hint of the hive metaphor. Ayer was furious, insisting the marketing betrayed the film's soul. In truth, the mismatch created confusion. Audiences arrived expecting wall-to-wall action and instead encountered a layered parable. Yet this very misstep ensured the film's afterlife. Viewers argued about it, debated whether it was smart or heavy-handed, and in the process, they kept it alive in cultural conversation. Behind the camera, camaraderie developed in unexpected ways. Statham and Ayer bonded over their shared commitment to authenticity, often staying late to review footage together. Crew members described evenings where Statham, still in costume, would wander to the bee enclosures and watch quietly, as though drawing energy from the creatures. Other actors, less central to the story, admitted they often felt caught between awe and bemusement at his dedication. Helena Bonham Carter's Marla in another film had her makeup deliberately smeared. Here, Statham had dirt and sweat reapplied between takes to ensure nothing ever looked clean. Both approaches spoke to the same philosophy: imperfection is authenticity. Fun facts trickle through production lore. In one scene, Statham demanded to perform a dangerous stunt himself, jumping from a moving truck onto another vehicle, despite insurance concerns. The take succeeded, but the crew described the tension as unbearable, convinced they might watch their lead actor injured. In another, the director reportedly encouraged improvisation in interrogation sequences, telling actors to react instinctively rather than sticking rigidly to script. This led to some of the most unsettling performances, where the fear on screen was only partly staged. Perhaps the strangest ripple of all has been the film's cultural afterlife. Beyond its reception as action thriller, it unexpectedly boosted interest in real-world beekeeping. Associations reported a surge of new hobbyists citing the film as inspiration. The metaphor extended off-screen, seeding itself in reality in ways nobody anticipated. Fans posted images of themselves in beekeeping suits with captions about protecting the hive, blurring the line between parody and genuine commitment. Few films inspire such literal enactment of their symbols. This one did. Looking back at the production, what fascinates me most is how inseparable it feels from the film's themes. The secrecy of the script mirrored the shadowy hive. The live bees embodied the fragility of order. The claustrophobic sets embodied suffocation under corruption. The buzzing in the soundscape embodied paranoia. Even the marketing missteps embodied illusions sold to the public. The production didn't just make a film, it lived it. And perhaps that is why the final product resonates so strangely. It is not simply a story told on screen but an experience born from chaos, precision, secrecy, and accident. It feels less like entertainment crafted in Hollywood than like a hive itself. Messy, buzzing, dangerous, but capable of producing something golden. The world of this story is as much a character as the beekeeper himself. Every location, every shadow, every texture of light carries meaning. The settings don't just host the action, they mirror it, amplifying the contradictions between serenity and chaos, order and corruption, creation and destruction. When I think about the cinematic elements at play, I don't just remember the fists and explosions. I remember the way the world looked and sounded, the way it felt alive with metaphor, as if each space were humming with the same hidden energy as a hive. It begins in the countryside, in the quiet world of hives lined up like small temples. These opening images are warm and golden, saturated with the kind of light that makes everything appear gentle. The rural setting feels timeless, untouched by the noise of modernity. Here the beekeeper moves slowly, methodically, his gestures deliberate. The bees swarm and hum in a harmony that feels ancient. This place is more than a backdrop, it is a meditation, a physical manifestation of balance. The cinematography lingers on close-ups of bees crawling across honeycomb, the glisten of wax, the subtle vibrancy of life within the hive. Every frame whispers, "This is what is at stake." The peace of this place is not decorative. It is the soul of the story. Then comes the intrusion of modern corruption, and with it, a dramatic shift in setting. Offices glow with sterile white light, computer screens flicker with cold blues, and urban landscapes stretch out in glass and steel. The city is not filmed as a place of opportunity but of suffocation. Its architecture looms, its lines harsh, its colors drained. Where the countryside radiates warmth, the urban spaces pulse with artificiality. The scammers' offices are claustrophobic, packed with screens and headsets, each cubicle a cell in a hive gone rotten. The juxtaposition is deliberate. One hive hums with creation, the other with exploitation. The house where the beekeeper lives functions as a liminal space between these worlds. Modest, cluttered, tinged with the warmth of the elderly neighbor's visits, it feels lived in, though shadowed by solitude. When tragedy strikes, its walls seem emptier, its silence heavier. The production design uses this space not only as a personal anchor but as a reminder of vulnerability, the fragility of community, of trust, of the connections that tether us to humanity. As the story widens, the environments grow harsher, reflecting the escalation of conflict. Warehouses filled with machinery become battlegrounds, their metallic echoes amplifying the brutality of hand-to-hand combat. Boardrooms gleam with polished glass and sterile order, their emptiness revealing the coldness of the elites who inhabit them. Streets at night glimmer with neon, rain turning pavements into mirrors that reflect both beauty and decay. The director frames these spaces with a sense of unease, using long shadows and muted palettes to make every environment feel like a hive on the brink of collapse. The paper street house of another story haunts me here, because the paper street house was rot personified. In this tale, the beekeeping farm is the mirror opposite. Fragile but harmonious, honest in its labor, sacred in its calm. Yet both share something in common. They are metaphors disguised as places. Lighting becomes a language of its own. Golden light for the apiary. White fluorescent sterility for offices. Sickly green tones for spaces of corruption. Deep, moody shadows for confrontations. Explosions bathe climaxes in firelight, suggesting both destruction and purification. This visual design is not accidental. It's a constant reminder of the hive metaphor: light and shadow, growth and decay, survival and death. Sound ties these settings together in uncanny ways. The countryside hums with bees, birds, and wind through fields. The city drones with sirens, electronics, the mechanical chatter of machines. In underground spaces where violence erupts, the sound design leans into thuds, grunts, and echoes, each impact reverberating like a drumbeat. Beneath it all, subtle buzzing lingers. Sometimes you hear it clearly, other times only in the background, subconscious and insistent. The hive is always present, whether through the literal sound of bees or through electronic distortions that mimic their hum. It's as though the world itself is buzzing, alive with tension. Cinematographic techniques heighten this immersion. The rural scenes are often filmed with steady frames, wide angles, patient pacing. The urban and combat sequences shift into handheld immediacy, close-ups of fists colliding, cameras weaving through chaos. This deliberate alternation mirrors the psychological journey. Calm fractured by violence, order disrupted by chaos. The frame itself becomes unstable when the hive is threatened. Even color grading participates in the allegory. Warm earth tones dominate early, gradually giving way to steel grays, toxic blues, and acidic greens as corruption spreads across the story. By the climax, fiery oranges and reds consume the frame, as skyscrapers and systems collapse into flame. And in the final images, ambiguity reigns, ashes and smoke bathed in neutral light, suggesting neither triumph nor defeat, only aftermath. Accidents peppered the production. During a warehouse fight sequence, a stunt wall collapsed too early, pinning a performer. The injury was minor, but the footage was kept, it had an authenticity that rehearsed choreography lacked. In another instance, real bees escaped during a close-up shot, scattering extras and crew. The chaos delayed filming but gave the director an idea for a later scene, where the beekeeper's enemies panic in a confined space while chaos swarms around them. Life fed art, unpredictably and sometimes painfully. The cultural ripples began even before the film premiered. Journalists covering the production seized on the oddity of Statham training with real bees. Memes circulated about him punching wasps between takes. Yet when the film finally released, that oddity became part of its legend. Beekeeping clubs reported spikes in interest, with new members citing the film as inspiration. Online forums filled with fans joking, or not joking, about joining the hive. It is rare for a revenge thriller to inspire literal hobbies, but this one did. In the end, the behind-the-scenes story mirrors the film itself. Ayer fought for authenticity against executives who preferred illusion. Statham balanced brutality with unexpected gentleness. Real bees buzzed through sets, stinging crew and shaping metaphor. Stunt performers bled for realism. Secrets kept the hive of production alive with paranoia. And the result was a film that, like its protagonist, was both orderly and chaotic, brutal and delicate, grounded in reality yet buzzing with allegory. To me, this is why the production matters as much as the finished film. It shows that meaning isn't only built in scripts or symbolism, it is also forged in the messy, unpredictable process of creation. The hive wasn't just on screen. It was alive behind the cameras, too, buzzing with the same contradictions that make the story unforgettable. Themes in this film move like bees through a hive, sometimes visible, buzzing in clear patterns, sometimes hidden, humming beneath the surface, shaping everything without being seen. To watch it closely is to realize that what might look like a simple revenge thriller is, in fact, a meditation on survival, justice, community, and corruption. It's a story that hums with questions. What does it mean to protect a hive that's already poisoned? How far can one go in the name of balance before becoming the very threat one seeks to destroy? The first and most obvious theme is the hive itself, both as metaphor and as mirror. Bees function collectively, each part serving a role, the survival of the whole depending on sacrifice and discipline. The beekeeper is not simply tending insects, he is tending to an idea of society, one in which order is fragile and predators always lurk. The narrative uses this metaphor to frame every action. Scammers become parasites, corporations become wasps feeding off the hive's labor, politicians become keepers of diseased colonies. This theme is universal, and what makes it resonate is how uncomfortably true it feels. Our own world functions as a hive, fragile and easily corrupted, and the question the film asks is whether anyone has the courage, or the right, to burn away the poison. Revenge, another central theme, pulses at the heart of the story. It begins as personal vengeance, the death of an elderly neighbor whose kindness tethered the beekeeper to humanity. But revenge here is never simple. Each act of retribution expands the scope of his war, shifting from individual predators to entire systems. The personal becomes political, the vendetta becomes crusade. The theme forces us to ask, where does revenge end, and where does justice begin? And more hauntingly, when does justice become indistinguishable from vengeance? Justice itself is tangled in paradox throughout the narrative. The beekeeper does not trust legal systems. They are shown as complicit, corrupt, or powerless. His justice is extrajudicial, immediate, and absolute. He is judge, jury, and executioner, and the film forces us to wrestle with that discomfort. Some critics read him as fascistic, others as mythic, and that ambiguity is deliberate. The theme of justice here is not tidy. It is jagged, contradictory, buzzing with the tension between order and destruction. Loyalty is another thread, woven into the beekeeper's past and present. His oath to the clandestine organization once defined him, and his defiance of it defines him still. Loyalty to the hive is central to their creed, yet his loyalty has shifted, from the abstract hive of the organization to the fragile hive of individual lives destroyed by corruption. This tension between personal and institutional loyalty drives much of the conflict, asking whether true loyalty lies in obedience or in resistance. Sacrifice hums beneath every action. Bees sacrifice themselves instinctively for the hive, and the beekeeper mirrors this ethic. He risks his life, his anonymity, his freedom to strike back at parasites. Yet his sacrifices are complicated, they are violent, destructive, sometimes indistinguishable from domination. The theme of sacrifice here is not purely noble. It is troubling, forcing us to question whether destruction in the name of preservation is ever truly justified. Corruption, of course, forms the poisoned honey at the core of the hive. The scammers are not isolated predators. They are the lowest rung in a ladder that stretches up to corporations and political elites. The film insists on showing how corruption is systemic, how rot at the top trickles down to destroy the most vulnerable. This theme gives the story its urgency. The hive is not only under attack from outside but sick from within. And the beekeeper's mission is both to purge the poison and to confront the terrible truth that sometimes the hive cannot be saved without fire. Isolation versus connection is another thematic tension. The beekeeper begins as a man alone, hiding in solitude, speaking more to bees than to people. His bond with the elderly neighbor pulls him briefly into connection, and her loss pushes him back into isolation. Yet throughout his crusade, echoes of community emerge. Allies who admire his clarity, enemies who see him as traitor, bystanders who wonder whether he is protector or menace. Connection is fragile here, easily destroyed, yet it remains the only antidote to despair. By the end, the question remains: can a man who has burned so much ever find connection again, or is his hive destined always to be empty? Symbolism saturates every frame. Bees symbolize both fragility and fury, their hum present even in scenes without them. Honeycombs symbolize order, structure, the beauty of collective creation. Fire symbolizes both destruction and purification, cleansing diseased hives but leaving scars that cannot be undone. The beekeeper himself is a symbol, not just a man, but an archetype of guardian and executioner, protector and destroyer. His duality forces us to see that every act of protection carries the risk of violence, every act of vengeance the risk of corruption. Even the elderly neighbor becomes symbolic. She is the soul of the hive, innocent, vulnerable, unprotected. Her death is not simply tragedy but allegory. The hive has been poisoned, and her loss reveals the rot that has spread too far. She haunts the film as ghost and metaphor, her absence buzzing in every act of destruction that follows. The clandestine organization embodies another layer of symbolism. Order calcified into tyranny. They believe themselves guardians, but their secrecy and complicity reveal them as corrupted keepers. They are the rigid hive that refuses to adapt, the colony that protects itself at the expense of those it claims to serve. Facing them, the beekeeper is not merely fighting enemies but confronting the twisted reflection of himself. For me, the most profound theme is balance, the fragile, impossible balance between preservation and destruction. Bees maintain balance through discipline, sacrifice, cooperation. The beekeeper maintains balance through violence, yet his violence risks tipping the hive into collapse. The film refuses to answer whether he saves or destroys. It insists only that the hive was poisoned, and that he, in his fury, became both cure and disease. This refusal to resolve is what lingers. The final images, fire, collapse, silence, are not triumph or tragedy but ambiguity. Did he protect the hive? Did he doom it? Or did he simply reveal that no hive can ever be safe from its own corruption? That question hums louder than any explosion, and it is why the film feels less like a revenge thriller than like a fable. Themes and symbolism here are not decoration, they are the hive itself. They structure the story, hum beneath the action, sting when least expected. They make us see beyond the fists and fire into the allegory buzzing underneath. And in doing so, they remind us that cinema, like a hive, is not only about what is visible but about the unseen structures that hold it together, or let it fall apart. The filmmaking choices behind this story are inseparable from the story itself. Every frame, every cut, Every layer of sound works not only to entertain but to extend the metaphor of the hive, to embody the tension between order and chaos. And then there is the curious arc of its release. How a film so deliberately crafted to sting audiences with allegory was marketed, misunderstood, praised, condemned, and eventually folded back into the very systems it sought to critique. To talk about its techniques and its box office fate is to see the hive from another angle. Not only on screen, but in the machinery of cinema itself. Cinematography was the first weapon. David Ayer and his team leaned into contrasts so sharp they almost cut. The rural apiary sequences glow with golden warmth, steady frames, and wide compositions that breathe with serenity. These images feel timeless, as if we are looking at something sacred. Then, abruptly, the palette shifts. Urban landscapes are desaturated, buzzing with sickly blues and greens, filmed with handheld immediacy that makes every chase feel claustrophobic. The contrast is not only visual but thematic, the serenity of the hive against the chaos of the poisoned world. Even within fight sequences, this philosophy holds. The camera stays close, often too close, forcing us to feel the suffocation of combat, the instability of the hive under attack. Lighting becomes another form of storytelling. Warm natural light saturates the apiary, evoking harmony. Fluorescent sterility dominates offices and scam centers, a constant reminder of artificiality. Shadows pool in warehouses and boardrooms, creating an atmosphere of rot beneath the surface. Fire consumes climaxes, washing scenes in orange and red, suggesting purification by destruction. What fascinated me was how consistently the lighting obeys the metaphor. Light is not just illumination, it is judgment, revealing which spaces are alive, which are diseased, and which are being purged. Editing choices mirror the buzzing hum of the hive. Early scenes breathe with patience, long takes dwelling on bees, hands tending combs, the quiet of the countryside. But as violence escalates, so does the pace. Cuts become sharper, faster, fragmented, mimicking the chaos of swarming. Ayer even allowed sequences to feel disorienting, breaking continuity in subtle ways to keep audiences off balance. This instability reflects the story's psychological undertones, the sense that balance has been shattered and only fragments remain. Sound design, too, works as metaphor. The film is threaded with buzzing, sometimes overt, sometimes subliminal. In tense moments, the hum grows louder, as though the hive itself were vibrating with unease. In fight scenes, punches thud not like stylized effects but like real impacts, wet, bruising, heavy. Offices drone with keyboards and phones, sterile sounds that numb rather than excite. Explosions tear through with bass-heavy roars, but beneath them, the hum persists. The decision to weave these sounds into the score, recorded from real hives and electronically distorted, gives the film an auditory texture unlike most action thrillers. You don't just watch it, you feel it vibrating in your bones. Practical effects dominate, giving the violence a raw authenticity. Statham performed many of his own stunts, leaping between vehicles, brawling in confined spaces, bruising himself in pursuit of realism. The fight choreography rejected elegance in favor of awkward brutality. Walls cracked, glass shattered, sweat dripped. Violence filmed not as spectacle but as survival. Even in larger set pieces, CGI was restrained. Explosions were staged practically whenever possible, giving fire and debris a weight digital imagery often lacks. This commitment to the tangible mirrors the Beekeeper's ethos. Authenticity over illusion, grit over gloss. Box office performance, however, told its own story. With a budget estimated around $40 million, expectations were modest yet hopeful. The studio marketed it as a straightforward Jason Statham revenge vehicle, leaning heavily on explosions and one-liners. Trailers downplayed the allegory, fearing that audiences would be alienated by its metaphorical weight. This mismatch created confusion. Some viewers arrived expecting relentless spectacle and were surprised by the film's philosophical undertones. Others, drawn by Ayer's reputation, expected allegory and were dismayed by what they saw as simplicity. As a result, Opening weekend numbers were strong but not spectacular. In the United States, it earned steady but unspectacular returns. Internationally, however, it fared better. Audiences in Europe and Asia embraced its allegorical layers, reading it as commentary on corruption, collectivism, and systemic exploitation. The global box office eventually pushed the film past profitability, though not into blockbuster territory. What fascinated me was how differently regions interpreted the story. In some places, it was celebrated as parable. In others, consumed purely as action. The hive metaphor proved elastic, capable of meaning many things to many people. Critically, the split was sharp. Some praised its grit, its refusal to glamorize violence, its metaphorical ambition. Others dismissed it as heavy-handed, a revenge thriller pretending to be profound. But even negative reviews admitted its strangeness, that buzzing hum, that fixation on bees, that duality of peace and chaos. And strangeness, in cinema, often ensures longevity. The film's afterlife reveals the deepest irony. Just as it critiqued systems of exploitation, it became a product of those systems. Merchandising campaigns sold soap embossed with Bee logos, posters plastered Statham's face over taglines about justice, and fans on social media turned quotes into slogans. That is why the film endures beyond numbers. It is not only an action thriller but an experiment in making cinema buzz like a hive, uncomfortable, dissonant, alive with metaphor. Its financial story, like its narrative, refuses to resolve neatly. It survived, profited modestly, and left behind a cultural sting sharper than any explosion. And that sting is its true success. Conclusions are often the hardest to write, because they ask us to step back and see the whole shape of something that was built piece by piece, frame by frame, moment by moment. With this story, the act of concluding feels even more complex, because it resists being summed up neatly. Like a hive, it is too layered, too alive with contradictions, to reduce to a single sentence. And yet, in tracing its arc from the hum of bees in quiet fields to the roar of fire-consuming towers, we do find something coherent. A meditation on justice, community, vengeance, and the fragile balance between creation and destruction. The beekeeper himself is the key to this conclusion. He begins as a solitary figure, tending to bees with the patience of a man trying to bury his past. He ends as a scarred archetype, no longer just a man but a symbol of something larger, the dangerous dream of absolute justice. Along the way, he embodies paradoxes. Tender